So welcome everyone. My name is Kelly Crace. I'm the Associate Vice President for Health and Wellness. I'm coming to you in a little bit of a different capacity, and that is in my life's work in the area of flourishing. I'm a psychologist by training. My role as Associate Vice President is I serve the needs of all of the frontline health and wellness departments at William and Mary. That includes campus recreation, the counseling center, the health center, health promotion, and the Center for Mindfulness and Authentic Excellence. So let's jump right in. Today's topic is about flourishing through chronic too-muchness, a topic that is very dear to us and very relevant for all of us, I think, during these times. One of the things that we know about the psychology of flourishing is our brain is very adaptable to various things that are episodic in terms of episodic too-muchness. When we go through crunch periods, it's very natural for us to come in to that crunch period, gearing up for it, because we know there's an end in sight that we can then restore and find a recalibration of our energy. But what happens when we move into a place of chronic too-muchness, where it seems like there's no end in sight, to where demands exceed our time and our energy and our resources? What eventually happens is that moves from a place of stress to strain. And that's what a lot of your adult students are experiencing right now. There's no way that they're at the same energy level as they were in August at the beginning of this year, this academic year. And yet they still have to be very busy. You're the same way probably. In your life right now, there are so many things of importance to you that are pulling on your time and energy, and there's not enough time and energy in the day. How do we manage these periods of chronic too-muchness? Actually, how do we actually flourish? For those of you that have had the misfortune of hearing me speak before, my apologies. And I want you to know that some of these things you may have heard before, but we're going to talk about them a little bit in the context of how to think about this during times of burnout conditions. How do we flourish through burnout conditions? How do we not burn out when we're actually in an environment that is a burnout-like culture? And it's about being able to recognize that a lot of this is about perspective. By all means, if you can change your environment to be less straining, that's certainly what we want to do. But what if we find ourselves in a place of burnout conditions? And how do we manage that? And for those of you that have heard me before, my definition of flourishing is a little different than how society defines it today. I've spent 35 years studying flourishing and working with a wide diversity of individuals and cultures around the components of flourishing. And I'm even tired of the term these days because it's gotten so distorted where flourishing means that, oh, we're just happy all the time and we're doing our best all the time and we're not affected by anything. And that's not flourishing at all. Flourishing is while affected by our own fears and worries and while affected by the world around us, how do we engage in a healthy way in things that are meaningful to us? How do we deepen a sense of productivity, deepen a sense of fulfillment, and deepen a sense of resilience in a relentless world? That's what we were interested in studying. Well, what I want to share with you today is there was a period of time in our work, in our 35 years, there was a period of time in our work of a 4-year period where we were working specifically with a wide range of organizations that were noted for being burnout cultures. In other words, there was a high rate of turnover, there was a high rate of burnout within the organizations. What did individuals and organizations do that didn't burn out? What did they do that despite burnout conditions, what did they do to prevent burnout, or what did they do to quickly recover from burnout? That there was not a high turnover in these organizations. These organizations that we worked with were our social justice advocates and activists. They were people in nonprofit organizations that had decided to commit their life to rolling that big boulder of social justice uphill every day. And in situations that were often just absolutely exhausting and at times heartbreaking. What did people do that flourished during those burnout conditions? And we found that they didn't get more complex, and it wasn't anything that was absolutely brilliant that we would have never thought of. They actually got more elemental. They got more basic. And they focused on 3 primary things. every day. They were very intentional every day on three primary things that I call the essential nourishment of flourishing during chronic burnout. And they did three minor things every day. So I called those the essential seasonings. So you have to have the essential nourishment for it to foundationally work. But the essential seasonings kind of add to the robustness and richness and the effectiveness of the essential nourishment. So what I want to share with you today, I have a loving challenge. I want to share with you those three essential nourishments and those three essential seasonings. And I want you to try these every day for the next 8 weeks. It takes less than 5 minutes a day, but I want you to try these every day for the next 8 weeks. Practice this every day for the next 8 weeks. And then I want you to call me and I want you to tell me what you notice. I'm going to leave you my phone number, my cell phone. I want you to call me or email me and tell me what you notice. Why 8 weeks? Well, we know through neuroplasticity that it takes about 15 weeks of mindful intention around something for it to actually cause neurological change. I would like to hear from you halfway through. So before we get into that, if you'll allow me to geek out for just a couple of minutes to explain why we drift into a place of strain and why your adult student is vulnerable to this and why you are actually vulnerable to this too. And how do we move out of this strain into more of a place of flourishing? So if I can share my screen real quickly. So I hope you can see this okay with the screen, with the flourishing through chronic too-muchness. And Sabrina, step in if for any reason it is not showing up as it should be. But I want to share with you a little bit about why we are vulnerable to stepping into this flourishing through chronic too-muchness. And it all centered around this essential thing that we found of the relationship between values and flourishing. We were interested in looking at the relationship between the attention to values and effectiveness, a deeper level of effectiveness, of greater productivity, fulfillment, and resilience. And we thought at one time that this relationship looked like this, because that's what the previous research had theorized and had indicated as well. In other words, what this means is the more I am focusing on what matters to me, the more effective I should be, which made sense because if we focus on what is important, then we'll be motivated. And if we're motivated, then we'll act. But what we found is that's not what happens. What happens is this. It looks like this. Because we actually found that the more you focus on what's important to you, the more we find there are conflicting motivations, that not just our values come into play, but other things come into play that we as human beings don't manage very well. And because of that, we then have conflicting actions. So we were fascinated by the inverted U of this nature of this relationship between values and effectiveness, this deeper level of flourishing, and wanted to understand that. And essentially what we came to learn is what happens to our brain when something becomes important to us. When something matters to us and becomes important to us, there's three unavoidable truths that we can't escape. The first is uncertainty. Truth is, you never completely control everything that goes into something that matters to you. There's always a chance you could lose or fail that thing of importance. And if you did, you would pay a cost. You would hurt in some way. But we're also aware in today's time that anytime we engage in something that matters to us, we're aware that people are forming opinions about it. There's this perceived evaluation that's going on around us, that people are watching us and they're not watching us neutrally. They're forming opinions about us. If we dare to care, you can't avoid these three things. And when these three things get activated, this is the result. You may have heard me talk about this before, but this is the fear of failure. This is when the why starts to become eclipsed with the what if. What if I fail? What if I lose this thing or person of importance? And we experience that as pressure. It's not danger fear, but it's the kind of fear that we feel that is like pressure, psychological pressure, which is not a bad thing. It's fine. But if we were to naturally respond to this value-centered pressure, we tend to go in one of two ways. We tend to either over-control and master, or we avoid and escape until it has to be done. Why do we do this? We learn that perfectionism and procrastination are the neurologically natural ways we cope with values-based fear. Why do we do this? It's because it works. It actually works. This is called the fear-based model of excellence, because if we can do it perfectly, or if we can control everything, I don't have to worry about failing. Or if I can sidestep this pressure and step into it when it has to be done, well, when it has to be done, it doesn't matter if I'm afraid. This works because it kicks our body and our brain into a different gear of motivation and a different gear of focus. That's why a lot of people say, I wait until the last minute because I work better under pressure. You actually don't, but what you're experiencing is that increased gear of motivation and focus. So it helped us understand this, because what happened with this model of excellence, and another thing that you may have heard me say before, but is really important to understand, this generation of young adults has the highest incidence of fear of failure than any other previous generation because of something wonderful about them. This generation no longer wants to succeed. They want to succeed in something that matters, something of meaning. But the competition for those meaningful opportunities has never been more fierce. So importance is higher, uncertainty is higher, and therefore fear is higher. By the time they reach our doorsteps on our campus, they have become specialists and experts at controlling and avoiding their way to excellence because they've been a part of the portfolio culture. The portfolio culture of this gets to this gets to this, and this linear expectation starts to develop of what I need to succeed, which means any detour around that is not just a disappointment, it's devastating. And so they develop this very sophisticated level of over-controlling and avoidance to move forward. Here's the problem. The fear-based model of excellence eventually hits a ceiling effect and an increasing cost. We just can't pull it off the way that we used to. It starts to get in the way of our better performance, and it starts to eat away at our resilience. And it starts to have an increasing cost. So it helped us understand a little more about what's going on with this. It's like, oh, okay, so under-attending to our values through avoidance, that leads to less effectiveness, but over-attention to our values can cause us to move into this controlling, over-controlling mechanism that also leads to us being less effective, because whenever a value is over-attended to, it's now drifted into a need. It's no longer I value achievement, I need to achieve. I don't value belonging, I need to belong. And that puts us in a psychological mindset of press. We're pressing too hard. And when we're pressing too hard, we've over-identified this need at the expense of other important values, and it just becomes less effective. On the other side, when we're under-attending to a value, we're calling something important in our life, this matters to me, but we're treating it like a want, a preference. And whenever something is a want or a preference, there's not the psychological commitment behind it to actually cause us to engage in that on a regular basis. In other words, what leads is our emotionality, our emotional comfort. So I may want to be fit, but if I'm not feeling it today, or I'm feeling a lot of other emotions, well, that's going to lead versus my commitment to being fit. And what it does is that gravitates us into a psychological mindset of hope. Hope is a wonderful thing, but not as a motivational strategy. I didn't study for this test. I hope it's easy. I have social anxiety and I'm nervous about getting out in front of people, so I'm just going to stay in my dorm room and wait for people to come to me and hope that it works out okay. We found that the ideal sweet spot is in that middle ground where a value is truly being acted on as a value, that it's moved from want to value, which means there's more of a psychological commitment behind it. But when it's a value, it's also in perspective to keep it from moving in a need and over-identifying our self-worth by that. So it helped us understand that dynamic. Why does this get in the way? Why does the fear-based model of excellence get in the way? And why does it move from stress to strain? And it's essentially because whenever we start leading with fear, what started with the why has now become eclipsed with the what if. When we start leading with fear, we move into a need state. And what we're needing is reassurance that everything's going to be okay. We will start looking for that reassurance by how did things go? What were the outcomes of the day? What did I experience today? And what kind of data did it give me as to whether or not I'm going to be okay? And that causes the body and the brain to start keeping score. And we develop this chronically evaluative mindset, which now is the number one cause of insomnia today, because we rest the body, the mind turns on at night and starts replaying that day. And it never replays the day neutrally. it always replays it with some kind of judgment and punctuates it in some kind of critical judgment that causes us to then come up with a perfect plan tomorrow to compensate for today. And then we wake up with anxiety with the thought of having to engage in that perfect plan. This is fully human. We all do it, but we do it even more during important life transitions. And during important life transitions, when there's a lot more uncertainty ahead of us, that need for reassurance that I chose right, or I did right, or that this is going to work out okay, causes us to become even more focused on the outcomes of the day. And it moves from stress to strain. But what do we do about it? We became very fascinated by looking at individuals and what do we do about this during burnout conditions, when we're dealing with chronic too-muchness to where we're tired and we're disappointed sometimes and we can't really change the environment around us. But what can we do? What can we find that perspective? As many of you have heard from our work in the Authentic Excellence Initiative, is that we became very fascinated with, as we learned about these concepts and strategies, we became fascinated with, can you train it? The Authentic Excellence Initiative is a training program that we have developed for our students and faculty and staff to be able to engage in this. That's free of charge. And we have over 2,500 students a year go through this program. Well, how does it relate to the specific topic today of not burning out in burnout conditions, flourishing through burnout conditions? So I'm going to come to this loving challenge. But before I do, I have two questions that I want you to reflect on. Two important questions that have a lot to do with these strategies, the essential nourishment of flourishing through chronic too-muchness. Here are the questions. First question, and I want you to think of the answer and even jot it down. And if someone's with you at the time, share your answer with them. First question. These are very unfair questions, by the way, but you can imagine anything. First question. If you could only be remembered for one thing only, what would you want that to be? Which is totally unfair because you're going to be remembered for a lot of things. But if you could only be remembered for one thing, what would you want that to be? And why? Like when I remember Sabrina, the only thing I remember about Sabrina is this. This is the only thing I remember about her. What would she hope I would say? By the way, this is not a tombstone question. This can be someone that enters your life for a week and was only there for a week, but will only remember one thing about you. What would you hope that would be? Jot that down and just mention it to someone next to you if you're not alone. Or talk out loud with yourself if you are alone. What would that be and why? Second question. If you could actually be remembered for two things, what would be the second thing that you'd add to the first? And are they related in any way? Are they blended in any way? Are they complementary? One helps the other. Are they complementary or are they not related at all? And that's okay if they're not. There's no right answer to that. But I do want you to think about that. What would be the second thing you'd add to the first? And do they relate to each other in any way? And why that second thing? Reflect on that a minute. So, what's the essential nourishment? Here are three things that I want you to practice every day. It takes less than 5 minutes, but I want you to practice this every day. First, I want you to start every day with this question. What opportunities are there for me to practice today the two things that I said I want to be remembered for? And be realistic with your time and energy. One day you may honestly say, I've got 30 seconds that I can think about these things, because there are a lot of other important things that you're dealing with that day. But there may be other days when you may say, I could step into these two things all day. I could immerse myself into these two things all day long. But start off every day with this question. What opportunities are there for me to practice today the two things I said I want to be remembered for? And be realistic with your time and energy. What's the power of this? Why this step? What's the power of this step? Human beings are most naturally motivated by fear and comfort. That's what we're most naturally motivated by. So we usually start the day with what has to be done, and then where do I seek comfort afterwards? Instead, the deepest form of human motivation are your values, but only if you have a relationship with them. And the way you develop a relationship with your values is to start being purpose-centered in your thinking at the beginning of every day. This drops you in to a deeper level of motivation that overrides fear and fatigue. So you want to start with purpose, because the answers to these two questions get at a central part of your purpose. It's not all of your purpose, but it's part of your purpose, and it's pretty central because it's the only two things you want to be remembered for if that were only possible. And so you want to start off with that day, even if you could only just dip into those two things. Second step, when you do step into those two things, do so with complete experiential acceptance. Complete experiential acceptance, which means I accept whatever happens. You can want good outcomes. You can want something good to happen, but I accept whatever happens. What's the power of this step? This starts to transform and change how you define your self-worth. Human beings typically naturally define their self-worth by the experiences that they have in their life, the outcomes of the day, the experiences of the day, which is fine. That's good. But when we flourish, we define our worth more by the engagement in the day. Engagement in what matters to us and the experiences that come from it both matter. Engagement has to matter more. The world pulls us to think more about experiences mattering more. We have to intentionally pull it to where we remind ourselves that my success of the day was the engagement part. And the experiences are just the mood of the day or the icing on the cake of the day, that it's a reward when it goes well. And when it doesn't go well, I focus more on self-care rather than, oh my God, what does this mean? What does this say about me? What does this say about my future? What does this say about the world around me? It's about engagement being the heart and soul of how we define our self-worth. Then at the end of the day, you take a moment and appreciate how you practice those two things with no buts allowed. You can't say, well, I practiced this for an hour, but I could have done it for 2. Well, I did this, but I could have done it so much better. No buts allowed. It's about honoring where you courageously stepped into the 2 things that you said you want to be remembered for. What's the power of this step? Very simply, it transforms purpose into meaning. It moves purpose into meaning. A lot of people feel purpose and meaning are too different, are the same. They're slightly different. Purpose is motivational. Meaning is reflective. And so for us to actually move purpose into meaning, we have to take time to pause and reflect where we've actually done that. And so it's about being able to say, take a moment and appreciate and value where I courageously stepped into those 2 things with no buts allowed. And this is the most neglected step. This is the most neglected step. And actually, it's the most critical because it was the tipping point that moved people from burnout to flourishing. It's what moved people to preventing burnout. This is what their narrative was. I am exhausted most days. And many of the days I'm heartbroken. And they would honestly say, it wasn't a platitude, it wasn't a cliche, because they worked on this every single day. They honestly said, and I'm living a life of meaning. And we found that in the truth of that, in the honesty of that, because they worked it, because they came to this third point, intentionality every day, that was enough to cause them to flourish during burnout conditions. Now, why do I use the term courageous? It's because these 3 steps are hard. They're not complex. They're simple, but they're not hard. They're simple, but they're very hard to do. And so in that, that's actually what courage is. Courage is being able to step into something that's hard, that's right. Stepping into right hardness is courageous. And we need to honor that courage. By the way, this third step is different than a gratitude journal. Gratitude journals are wonderful things. I highly recommend them. But gratitude journals can drift into being grateful for things that have happened to me. Instead, I want you to also spend time being appreciative of where you courageously stepped in to these two things and engaged in them. And that builds a sense of meaning. It doesn't have to be a 30-minute self-love fest. It can be when you're brushing your teeth at night. But it's so important to do that. Before I move to the next thing, I noticed there's a question, so I want to just check on it real quick and see if I need to respond to it now. And then we'll respond to it later. Okay, great. What is the second thing other than engage? That is the second thing. The second step is to do so with experiential acceptance. So that's a great question. Thank you so much. It's doing so, and I can't see your name right now because of my screen, but it's about doing so with complete experiential acceptance. So your engagement is everything. The engagement and seeing engagement as completely enough. So it's doing so with experiential acceptance. Great question. And can those two things change over time? Absolutely, Catherine. Those things can absolutely change over time. And in fact, they do. And that's why you want to ask this every day. You want to be able to kind of, as I ask these things, I start to become more honest with myself. And in so doing, I find myself, let me move this out of the way so I can. So yes, what happens over time is if I ask these questions each time, I also start to realize when things change, because we're dynamic human beings. Our values are dynamic because what these things are about is we interact with our life. And in our life around that, our life impacts us and it can change what starts to matter to us. And as we start doing this and engaging in it, we do realize that things are shifting, and you want to pay attention to that and go back to that question. I'll also share with you another resource that you can use to get at that question of what matters to me even more. So I'll come back to questions here in a minute, but here's the bottom line. And so essentially what we're talking about is the essential nourishment is starting each day with purpose and engaging with experiential acceptance and focusing on the meaning that that had for us at that time of that engagement. The essential seasonings are essentially this. Every day, step into something enjoyable. You're never too busy to step into something enjoyable, even if it's for 30 seconds. And every day, step into something healthy. And every day, and this was a surprise to us in our research, every day, step into both giving and receiving encouragement. Giving and receiving encouragement. And we found that this is what these individuals that were in burnout conditions were very intentional about doing every day. Those essential things, but they also seasoned those essential things with something enjoyable, something healthy, and both giving and receiving encouragement. And we found that that was just enough. So how do we think about that for ourselves so that we lead with this instead of our fears and insecurities that we may have about our adult students that can cause us to move into controlling behavior or too much avoidance behavior? How do we find that right blend of engagement with our students in a way that has perspective? And how do we coach our students into doing the same thing? And it can be as simple as being able to engage in them with, instead of how did today go? How did your test go? It can be starting with share something that was meaningful today that you did. Share something that you did today that was meaningful. What about that was meaningful? Encouraging them to get at issues of meaning and purpose. And what did you do that was enjoyable today? Being able to engage in those conversations first shows them that that matters most and helps them find perspective through chronic too-muchness. Well, here is my contact information because I want to hear from you in 8 weeks. I want you to call me or email me and tell me, what do you notice about engaging this every day? What are you observing? And I look forward to learning from you. I also wanted to let you know of a resource that's available that is related to being able to do this kind of relational work with values. Our research that we did, we took an empirical approach to values assessment that was a little different. We were looking less about what your values are and more about your current relationship with your values. And that's in the Life Values Inventory, which can be found at this open educational resource. You can see the link at the bottom. It's open and educational resource that's free and available to everyone. It's not just William and Mary, it's open to the general public. And it gives you an opportunity online to go and assess your relationship with your values, and it holds your data in a very secure way. For what we tell our students and what we tell people that we work with is we hope that you're doing this every year so that you can look and see, how are my values shifting based on where I'm at this time in my life? So I hope you'll go and check that out and get in touch with me with any feedback or questions that you may have with that. So, questions that you may have that I can be of help with in terms of how this relates to your adult student or how it may relate to you in your life right now. Let me see if I can pull them up real quick. So one question was, we worry that the time committed to essential seasoning overtakes time needed for the avoided task. Any ideas to help with that balance? Yes, the fear-based model of excellence, whenever we're leading with that fear-based model of excellence, that is what we'll do. We'll go to comfort, we'll go to soothing, and we'll overdo it. And the reason for that is we are leading with fear. We're overwhelmed by the what if, and that causes us to either spend too much time through over-controlling, or it causes us to avoid, to where we're really not doing healthy self-care or enjoyment, we're actually soothing. And when we do that, that's when we move away from flourishing, and that's when we move towards strain. So the way to recognize that is to recognize the strain that we're experiencing. These kinds of steps put that back in perspective, because primarily what I'm focusing on are things of purpose to me and things of meaning. And secondarily, I'm stepping into things of enjoyment and that are healthy. Can I show the slide with the contact information again? Yes, and by the way, I'm going to make these slides available to everyone. Sabrina, we will make sure that we send these out to you, and these will be available. But yes, I'm in the book, and when I'm done answering the questions, I'll show the slide with the contact information again. Thank you for being willing to do that. How do we recommend imparting this to our students? One, in a very relational, conversational way. We can't do this in a parental way. We can't do this in a teaching way, because the kiss of death for our adult students is starting off with the first three words with you need to. You need to do this. That immediately causes a reaction on their part. And so being able to have relational conversations to where they see that that's really what you're interested in, that you have conversations about this with them, of asking them that same question. If you could only be remembered for one thing, what would it be? And if people were following you around for a month, how would they know that? And it's asking them, share something that was meaningful with me today, and share something you enjoyed, and being able to help grow them into that by asking and celebrating those questions. And when they are disappointed and when they have a bad outcome and the world beats them up that day because of disappointment after disappointment, it's about being there and saying, I know this is hurtful. It does sound hard and it does sound hurtful, and I know you're disappointed. How can you take care of yourself today? Instead of them going down that path of what does this say about me and what does this say about my future, it's about reminding them that when we're engaged in things that matter, if we're engaged in what matters to us, and on those days when the world beats us up, our next focus has to be on taking care of ourselves, and then getting up the next day of stepping into purpose. And so it's about doing it as you, not doing it as Kelly. You don't need to parrot me. You have the wisdom. Use it in your way of using your language to kind of get at some of these topics. And you can even talk about it from your standpoint. Instead of you need to say, well, when I think about this, this is kind of what I think about. Or you can sit there and say, hey, I listened to a webinar with Kelly, and a couple of things were really interesting to me. I found this really interesting. He said this, and I found that really interesting. What do you think about that? It's about really engaging in this adult conversation where you keep it about, I think, which gives them the opportunity to disagree with you, and it gives you the opportunity to ask, what do they think? And that's what creates that kind of horizontal relationship. Jan, thank you, Risa. I appreciate your question. I see on Amazon that you have a book coming out for organizations. Thank you very much. That's coming out in June. We have a book that's for individuals on authentic excellence, flourishing through during a relentless world. And we just are releasing one on organizations. At the same time, it's a small little book with textbook prices. And so I encourage you to go on our open educational resource that's free and available to everyone. And it has a lot of these concepts on it. So I really encourage you to look there and see if you find what you need there. If you do have an interest in the book, thank you for your support of that. But I think you could find the same thing through the open educational resource. Would the presentation be valuable to share with your students? Only if you feel like you would like to present it in a curious way of saying, you know, I found something really interesting. And would you mind if I shared it with you? It's Kelly, and he works out of CMAX, and he's talking about flourishing during burnout conditions. Would that be of interest to you? And if they say yes, then share it, but do it in that kind of invitational way. And also let them know that CMAX is here for them at whatever time they're ready. Any tips for not retaining bitterness as we don't have any agency in some outcomes? You know, that's just such a human thing. You know, when we get involved in recognizing the limitations of our agency around outcomes, it can really get to us over time. We can start to feel like, you know, I'm doing my part. I'm doing my part here. And if the world could just cooperate a little bit, if they could just cut me a break a little bit, it would be so much easier. It'd be so much nicer. You know, we have to allow that humanity. We have to allow the human disappointment, the bitterness, the anger, the sorrow, because really what the bitterness is about and what the anger is about is just sorrow. It's hurt. We're hurting because this is so hard. And what we find is we have to honor that reaction and have to work toward not landing there. And we found with people that flourish, that's what they work on, is they work on honoring the human reaction for what they feel. And if they have a day of disappointing outcomes and you ask them, how are you feeling? They'll say, I'm disappointed. They feel the outcomes of the day, but they don't land there. And if you ask them, are you okay? They'll go like, oh, I'm okay. I succeeded because I'm engaged in what mattered to me. The world just beat me up for it today. They don't freak out with what does it mean. Instead, they focus on their self-worth doesn't change because of the engagement. It's just they allow the mood to change each day. And when they get beat up, they really focus on self-care and then show up the next day. And we found that the healing aspect of bitterness and the healing aspect of grief and the healing aspect of anger and sorrow is a commitment every day of stepping into something healthy and something purposeful, that's actually healing. It doesn't necessarily make us feel good in the moment. It doesn't make us feel better in the moment. We're still hurt. We're still upset. But we find that is healing. You won't feel it in the day, but you will feel it over time. You will heal through that bitterness if every day I will focus on engaging in something healthy and in something purposeful. Why? Because it moves you beyond your emotions and into a deeper meaning of purpose. It moves you to where I'm affected by what's happening. I'm just not defined by it. That's the biggest paradigm shift, is I can be affected by something without being defined by it because I can still engage in things that matter to me. Louisa had a question. It sounds like part of the problem begins far before college. Oh my goodness, it's so true. Is there research that shows that early education is about developing the whole person and critical thinking instead of competition and success? Yes, 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 yes. We live in an outcome-oriented world, and people that flourish don't deny the reality of that. They know they need outcomes to create opportunities for themselves. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but you're exactly correct, is we live in a portfolio culture that demands linearity, that creates an expectation of linearity. And yet we all know as adults that we live nonlinear lives. I wish our children had linear experiences, but they won't because we don't. We live in a nonlinear life. We live nonlinear lives, and we have to allow ourselves to develop ways to manage that nonlinearity. We just held a statewide summit on mental health here at the university that invited from the state the leaders in K through 12 and 2-year colleges and 4-year colleges to address this issue. And that was the heart of our whole conversation, is how do we start this work earlier? And we are starting it work earlier. We're working in the middle schools now with this information and in the high schools with this information to build this deeper sense of resilience. By the way, our research doesn't support that this is a snowflake fragile generation. This generation has resilience. It's just that the absurdity of the world around us and the uncertainty and the consequences of those uncertainties is so poignant right now and so loud that they need more advanced resilience strategies. So we take a strength-based approach. We don't take a remedial approach. We take a strength-based approach, and we respect their wisdom and we respect the resilience they come in here with. We just try to build upon it. And we have to do that ourselves as parents, because our biggest insecurities or fears are related to what happens with our children. Even if they're adult children, they are still our children. My babies are now 40 years old and 37, and they'll always be my babies. But it's about being able to join them in this humanity of this, of us talking about our struggles with this work and our challenges and our successes around this work. Marianne asked, do you find these strategies work with all ages? Yes. With cognitive maturity, we have to phrase it a little different with our middle school students than our high school students, than our college students. We phrase it a little differently, but the work is still the same. Fear is fear. Fear doesn't discriminate. And we work with this with all ages, including retirement age, including those of us that are making mid-career transitions. Fear is fear, and how we hold that fear determines whether we flourish or not. And so we're trying to work with this much younger, and we're trying to work with this as we move into older areas where we're thinking about retirement and yet still have 20 or 30 years of good living to do. How can we make that meaningful? We're just exploring that in terms, is there any discussion about the possibility of classical education maybe being a good alternative to current models? Yes, this is starting to leak into pedagogy. This is starting to move in to this aspect of pedagogy, of how do we bring this into our educational world to build a more of an advanced aspect of resilience. And why that's so important too is we have to be very careful of how we're politicizing education so that we look more at the honest, healthy development and that we use flourishing models as a way to build a healthy brain, and a healthy mind, and a healthy body, and a healthy spirit around this aspect of holistic, integrative wellness. How do we build our future leaders to be healthy? They are so critical to our future, and they need to be healthy and well at being able to do that. And so, yes, this is an important component as we think about pedagogy. We were talking about that at the summit. And one of the things that we talked about too is we have to move beyond the politicizing of education and really get at the heart of these issues in a very bipartisan way, because this is a human thing. It's not a partisan issue, it's a bipartisan issue. At parent orientation in August was another question. At parent orientation in August, you stated that our minds are wired for truth. Could you expand upon that? A lot of the things that we deal with here is our wisdom trying to gain ground, because these things we know what is healthy for us. Like with our students, they're very health literate. If we gave them a quiz on what is it that you need to do to be healthy, they would pass the quiz. Well, our question is, what keeps you from getting in the way of doing what you know to be healthy? And more times than not, it's fear. Fear causes them to move away from what they know to be true and meaningful about themselves. When we look at truth, we know there are some central universal truths to health and wellness that we need to attend to. And we know that the more value-centered we are, the more we step into meaning and purpose. And we know that predicts flourishing. And we know that we have the capacity to determine what matters to us and then to be able to act on it. And what usually gets in the way is fear. And fear is always a distortion. Fear will always distort truth. And so it's about us getting them to respect their wisdom and bring that wisdom forward and move fear slightly out of the way. We never get rid of it. That's why, by the way, the University 101 kind of classes in a lot of universities don't tend to be too effective because they focus so much on so many life skills that they only hit the surface level. And these are things that our students already know. Our questions are going deeper about how do you move deeper into a relationship with values? How do you actually change the way you think about fear? How do you develop advanced coping strategies to be able to courageously step into what you know is truly authentic for you? Great questions. Let me show my screen real quickly to bring back up my contact information. And again, this will be shown on YouTube and the Parent and Family YouTube site. And I look forward to hearing from all of you in 8 weeks. I look forward to learning from you as I have today with your wonderful questions. Thank you, everyone. I wish you all the best on the remainder of this semester and moving into the restorative time. Hopefully it's a restorative time in the summer. And when you're on campus, come visit me. Come visit me at the Wellness Center and come share your wisdom with me. I look forward to learning from you. I wish all of you the best. Take care.